3 words. That was all it took. Every man standing in Moonwell Hollow that morning would carry the sound of them for the rest of his life. The sky over the hollow was still pale silver, the kind of light that comes before the sun decides to rise. Mist clung to the grass. The old stone well at the center of the courtyard glowed faintly, the way it always did before dawn, as if the water inside remembered something the rest of the world had forgotten. Lila Winslow stood in the middle of that courtyard, surrounded by 6 of Garrett Bradford's riders. Her boots were planted in the dirt her father used to walk every morning. Her chin was lifted, though her hands were shaking behind her back where no one could see them. Dalton Keller held her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, not yet, but firm enough to remind her that he could. His face was calm, the kind of calm that came from never once needing to raise his voice to get what he wanted. That calm was what made him frightening. "Sign it," he said. "Save yourself the trouble." "The land isn't for sale," Lila answered. Her voice cracked in the middle, but she kept going. "My father left it to me. The spring belongs to the families who need it, not to Garrett." Elder Marshall Ellis stood a few paces back, holding a rolled parchment against his chest like a shield. He did not look at her. He had known Rowan Winslow for 20 years, had eaten at his table, had watched him pull sick children back from fevers with nothing but Moonwell water and patience. Now he stared at his own boots, because looking at Lila meant admitting what he was letting happen to her. The villagers watched from the edges of the courtyard, close enough to see, too far to help. Garrett controlled the food routes into the hollow. He controlled who got patrol protection during the cold months. Fear had a way of making good people very quiet. Dalton tightened his grip. The Alpha Court won't care what happens to one stubborn girl on a border estate. Nobody's coming to help you, Miss Winslow. That was the moment the forest went silent. It was not a slow silence. It was sudden, complete, as if every bird and every insect had decided at once to stop breathing. The horses felt it first. They shifted their weight and pulled at their reins. Then the black wolf stepped out of the tree line. It was enormous, its coat so dark it seemed to drink the pale morning light rather than reflect it. Its eyes were a burning amber, steady and unblinking. On its back sat a man in a travel-worn cloak, dust on his boots, road weariness in the set of his shoulders. He did not look wealthy. He did not look important. He looked like a man who had ridden a long way and had not slept properly in days. But he looked at Dalton's hand on Lila's wrist, and something in his expression went very still. He swung down from the wolf's back without hurry, boots landing soundlessly in the dirt. He walked forward, and the riders around Lila found themselves stepping back without deciding to. He stopped an arm's length from Dalton. "Touch her again," he said, "and you'll lose the hand that did it." Nobody moved. Dalton tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "Do you know who you're threatening, stranger?" The black wolf answered for him. It stepped forward and let out a low growl that seemed to come up through the ground itself, rattling the harnesses on the nearest horses. The stranger did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I don't repeat myself kindly a second time," he said. Dalton's fingers loosened. Lila's wrist slipped free, and she stumbled back a step, rubbing the spot where his grip had been. She looked at the stranger, really looked at him, and for the first time since her father's funeral, she did not feel like she was standing alone against the whole world. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that the dust on his boots came from roads that led to a throne, or that the calm in his voice was the calm of a man, used to being obeyed by kingdoms, not just courtyards. All she knew, standing there in the thin morning light with her heart hammering, and her wrist still warm from another man's grip, was that someone had finally come. Moonwell Hollow had never been a rich place, but it had always been a needed one. Lila's father, Rowan Winslow, spent his whole life tending the spring at the center of the estate. He was not a pack lord, and never wanted to be. He was a healer, the kind villagers walked for hours to reach when their own remedies failed. During the full moon, the Moonwell water grew strong enough to steady a weak wolf's shift, calm a fevered child, or knit a wound that refused to close. Rowan never charged for it. He believed the water was not his to sell. Lila grew up in that healing room. grinding herbs at her father's elbow, learning which roots eased pain and which only masked it. She remembered nights when strangers arrived at the gate, carrying sick children, and her father would light the lanterns without complaint, no matter how late the hour. She remembered, too, the winter a fever swept through 3 villages at once, and her father worked so many nights in a row that Lila began sleeping in the healing room herself, just to make sure he ate something before dawn. He never complained. He used to say that a healer who resented tired nights had chosen the wrong calling, and that Moonwell water given grudgingly helped no one, wolf or human. The spring doesn't ask who deserves it, he told her once, brushing dried lavender from his hands. It only gives. If I ever start deciding who's worthy of help, I'll have already failed everyone who comes to that gate. She had not understood, at 10 years old, why those words mattered so much to him. She understood them completely now. Then, 6 months ago, he collapsed in the garden and did not wake again. The village mourned him properly, the way people mourn someone who has never once turned them away. Farmers who could not afford proper coffins for their own kin still found silver to help bury him. Children left small bundles of wildflowers at the gate for weeks afterward. For a short while, grief was the only weight Lila had to carry, and even that felt almost bearable. Surrounded by so many people who had loved her father as much as she had, grief alone would have been hard enough. But grief came with a second visitor, Garrett Bradford, lord of the neighboring pack, who began sending letters within weeks of the funeral. The first letters were polite, mentioning old debts Rowan had supposedly left behind. Lila did not believe them, but she had no proof otherwise, and proof was not something grief left room to search for. She remembered the first letter clearly, how she had read it twice at the kitchen table, certain there had been some mistake. Her father had never once mentioned owing Garrett Bradford anything. He had barely mentioned Garrett at all, beyond the occasional tired remark about pack lords who mistook control for leadership. But the letter carried an official seal, and Lila, only weeks into her grief, had no strength left to fight a claim she could not immediately disprove. The letters became warnings. The warnings became riders at her gate, first only to deliver messages, then to linger, then to watch. Villagers who once stopped by for tea grew scarce, afraid that being seen too close to Lila might draw Garrett's attention onto their own households. Even Brinley's parents had quietly asked their daughter to keep her visits shorter, though Brinley had refused to listen, coming anyway, every single week, sometimes twice. And this morning, the riders had become Dalton Keller's hand around her wrist. Now, in the pale light of the courtyard, Lila stood staring at the stranger who had just sent Garrett's men scattering toward their horses. "You should leave before more of them come back," she told him, because gratitude felt too large and complicated to say out loud. "I'll leave when I'm certain you're safe," he said. "Not before." Dalton mounted his horse last, glaring at the stranger with the look of a man memorizing a face for later. "Garrett will hear about this." "Good," the stranger said. "Tell him exactly what you saw." The riders left in a cloud of dust, and Marshal Ellis lingered a moment longer than the rest, his surrender papers still clutched to his chest. He opened his mouth as if to say something to Lila, then closed it again and hurried after the others. Brinley Calloway came running from the edge of the courtyard the moment the riders were gone, her braid half undone from sleep, her face pale with worry. She threw her arms around Lila without asking permission, the way she had since they were children. "I saw them grab you," Brinley said against her shoulder. "I couldn't get here fast enough. I'm sorry, Lila. I'm so sorry." "You're here now," Lila said, and meant it. Wren Sullivan appeared behind Brinley, quieter, holding her younger brother's hand. The boy had been sickly 2 winters ago, saved only by the Moonwell water Rowan carried to their door himself. Wren looked at the stranger with open curiosity, then at Lila with something like relief. "Is it true?" Wren asked. "Is Garrett really trying to take the spring?" Lila did not answer right away. She looked instead at the stranger, who was watching the tree line as if he expected the riders to circle back. "He's been trying since my father died," she said finally. "This morning was the closest he's come to succeeding." Ren's brother tugged at his sister's sleeve, staring up at Noctis with wide, fearless eyes. Is that a real wolf, or is he a man too? Both, most likely, Brinley said, though she kept a careful distance herself, unused to seeing a wolf so massive standing so calmly in the middle of a courtyard. Ren pulled her brother gently back a step. Either way, he came when no one else would. That counts for something. Lila thought of the villagers who had watched from the edges of the courtyard that morning, too afraid of Garrett's reach to step forward, and did not blame them. Fear had kept the whole hollow quiet for months. She understood it too well to hold it against anyone but the man who had put it there. The stranger turned back to her, up close, in full daylight now. She could see the details she had missed before. A faint scar along his jaw, eyes the color of a winter sky, the kind of stillness that came from years of controlling every reaction on his face. He did not look like a wanderer. He looked like someone who had trained himself to be underestimated. "What's your name?" Lila asked. He hesitated only a breath before answering. "Trevor," he said. Nothing more. No title, no explanation for the black wolf standing calm and silent at his side. No reason why a lone traveler would risk his life for a stranger in a border courtyard. Lila studied him, waiting for more, but he only held her gaze, steady and unreadable. She decided she would ask again later. For now, it was enough that he had come, and that the sun was finally rising over Moonwell Hollow without Dalton Keller's hand on her wrist. Later that morning, once the courtyard had emptied and the villagers had drifted back to their own homes, Lila brought Trevor a plate of bread and cheese from the kitchen, more out of habit than hospitality. Her father had never let a visitor sit at Moonwell Hollow without offering them something to eat, and old habits did not disappear just because the man who taught them was gone. Trevor accepted the plate with a small nod of thanks, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Noctis lay stretched out near the well, watching a pair of sparrows argue over a fallen crumb of bread, as though it were the most important dispute in the valley. "You didn't have to feed me," Trevor said eventually. "You didn't have to stop them," Lila answered. "We're even." A faint smile crossed his face, the first she had seen since he arrived. It changed him, softened the sharp watchfulness in his eyes, and Lila found herself studying it longer than she meant to, before looking away toward the spring. "How long have you lived here alone?" he asked. "Since my father died. 6 months." She traced a crack in the stone wall with her fingertip. "Before that, I never lived here alone at all. Even when he was out treating patients 3 villages over, the house never felt empty. Now it does, most nights." "I'm sorry," Trevor said, and it did not sound like the practiced sympathy she had grown used to from Garrett's men, the kind offered right before another demand. It sounded like he meant it. "Everyone's sorry," Lila said, not unkindly. "Sorry doesn't stop Garrett's letters." "No," Trevor agreed. "But it isn't nothing either." She looked at him again, weighing the strange comfort of talking so plainly to someone whose name she had only known for a few hours. Most people in her life either handled her carefully, as though grief might shatter her further, or pushed past her grief entirely to get to what they wanted. Trevor did neither. He simply listened, the way her father used to listen to patients describe symptoms they were too frightened to name outright. "I should check the eastern fence," she said finally, standing and brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Garrett's men found a gap in it last month. If they come back tonight, I don't want it waiting open for them." "I'll come with you," Trevor said, already rising. She did not argue. Some part of her, the part that had spent 6 months carrying every burden of the estate alone, was quietly grateful not to have to ask twice. Trevor did not leave Moonwell Hollow that day. He said he wanted to be sure Garrett's men would not return before nightfall. And Lila, though wary, did not argue. She had learned, in 6 months of grief and pressure, that powerful men rarely offered help without expecting something back. So she watched him carefully as the day went on, waiting for the moment he would ask for payment. The moment never came. Instead, Trevor walked the boundary of the estate on foot, studying the fence line, the goat path behind the spring, the old bell tower that had not rung in years. He noticed things Lila herself had stopped seeing, a section of fencing weak enough to push through, a blind spot near the eastern wall where riders could approach unseen. He moved like a man reading a battlefield, not admiring scenery. His wolf, whom he called Noctis, stayed close to the spring the entire afternoon, lying in the grass with his amber eyes half open, alert even in rest. Lila found herself drawn to the wolf, despite her wariness of everything else that morning had brought. She had grown up around pack wolves, had seen shifts and half-shifts, and the ordinary strength of border patrol animals, but Noctis was different, larger, calmer, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost deliberate. "He doesn't act like the wolves I've seen at pack gatherings," she said, watching him from a careful distance. "He's older than most patrol wolves live to be," Trevor said, a note of quiet pride in his voice. "We've traveled together since I was young enough that half the court thought I was foolish for bonding so deeply with one animal, instead of rotating through several, the way tradition expects. Why did you?" "Because loyalty that deep is rare," Trevor said. "I wasn't willing to trade it away for tradition's sake." Noctis lifted his head briefly at the sound of his name, regarded Lila with unhurried amber eyes, then settled back into the grass, as though satisfied she posed no threat worth further attention. It was, Lila thought, oddly like being granted permission by someone far older and wiser than his years suggested. Lila followed Trevor at a distance at first, unsure whether to trust the quiet competence with which he moved across land that was not his. But curiosity eventually won out over caution, and by midday, she found herself walking beside him instead of behind him, pointing out details he might have missed, which parts of the fence her father had mended himself, which sections dated back to before she was born, where the ground grew soft enough in spring floods to trap a horse's hooves. "Your father built well," Trevor said, running his hand along a section of fence that had clearly survived many winters. Most border estates this size would have crumbled years ago, without proper coin behind them. "He didn't have coin," Lila said. "He had patience, and neighbors who owed him favors, they were happy to repay with labor instead of silver. It isn't the kind of wealth Garrett understands, but it's kept this place standing longer than his money ever could." Trevor considered that for a moment, his eyes tracking the tree line with the same careful attention he had given every other part of the land. Wealth measured in loyalty tends to outlast wealth measured in coin. Coin can be taken. Loyalty has to be earned all over again, by whoever tries to take it. "You sound like you've thought about that a great deal," Lila said. "More than I'd like to admit," Trevor said, and something in his tone told her the subject touched closer to home than he intended to explain just yet. "You know pack law," Lila said, watching Trevor examine the broken latch on the gate. "Better than most travelers I've met. I've spent time around the Alpha Court," he said, which told her nothing and everything at once. She wanted to press further, but something about the careful way he answered told her he was not ready to say more, and she respected that. She had her own things she was not ready to say. By late afternoon, they sat together near the well, the water catching the gold of the lowering sun. Lila noticed him glance, briefly, at the fading mark on her wrist, where Dalton's fingers had pressed too hard. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "Does he do that often?" Trevor asked. "Bradford's man. Only when I refuse to sign," Lila said, "which is every time. Why haven't you left? Sold the land and gone somewhere safer?" The question could have felt like an accusation. It did not. It sounded like genuine curiosity, the kind that wanted an honest answer rather than a convenient one. Lila looked out at the spring, silver and calm in the fading light. "Because families still come here in winter. Because my father spent his whole life making sure this water reached the people who needed it most, not the people who could pay the most. If I sell it to Garrett, he'll ration it. He'll use it to buy loyalty instead of giving it away freely." She paused. "I'm not brave, I'm just stubborn." "Those aren't as different as you think," Trevor said. "My father used to say the same thing," Lila said, a small, surprised smile crossing her face. "He said stubbornness was just courage that hadn't been given a reason to feel proud of itself yet. He sounds like he understood people well. He understood wolves and healing better than people, most days." Lila said, laughing softly, for the first time since the morning's danger. But he tried. He always tried, even with the ones who made it difficult. Trevor watched her laugh with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between admiration and a kind of quiet ache, as though the sound reminded him of something he did not often get to hear. "It's good to hear you laugh," he said simply. "I imagine there hasn't been much reason to, lately." "There hasn't," Lila admitted. "Not since before he died, really. Grief has a way of making a house very quiet." "For what it's worth," Trevor said, "the sound suits you better than the quiet does." No one had asked Lila what she wanted in a long time. Since her father's death, people had told her what she should do: sell, surrender, remarry into a stronger pack for protection, disappear quietly before Garrett made her disappearance permanent. Trevor was the first person who had simply asked, and then waited to hear the answer instead of arguing with it. She studied him in the dimming light. He did not look at her with pity, the way villagers sometimes did when they remembered her father, or with calculation, the way Garrett's men looked at the estate. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person worth listening to. It unsettled her more than Dalton's grip ever had, though in a very different way. As the sky darkened, Lila led him toward the house, past the garden, where her father used to work in the evenings. She stopped at a locked door near the back of the healing room, one she had not opened since the funeral. "My father kept records in here," she said, turning an old iron key. "I haven't had the heart to go through them." The door creaked open onto shadows, shelves of dried herbs, and a writing desk, still scattered with her father's things, exactly as he had left them. "Would you help me look?" she asked. Trevor stepped inside without hesitation. "Yes," he said, "I would." For a while, they worked in silence, Lila sorting through drawers of dried roots and half-finished remedies, Trevor examining the shelves for anything that looked deliberately hidden, rather than simply forgotten. Dust rose in slow columns through the last of the evening light, catching gold where it slipped through the shuttered window. "Your father was careful," Trevor said, running his fingers along the underside of a shelf and finding nothing. "Whatever he hid well. He was careful about everything," Lila said. "Measurements, dosages, which patients could pay and which couldn't. He never mixed those two lists up, not once. He said it wasn't a healer's business to remember who owed him anything." "That's rare," Trevor said quietly. "Most men in a position to help others eventually start keeping score." He wasn't most men. Lila paused over a small clay jar, turning it in her hands before setting it back exactly where it had been. "I used to think that made him weak. Garrett's people certainly thought so. A healer who gave everything away and asked for nothing back. It took losing him to understand it wasn't weakness at all. It was the hardest kind of strength there is." Trevor looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "I think you inherited more of that than you realize." Lila did not answer right away. She knelt instead, beside the herb cabinet, running her palm along the wall beneath it, out of habit, more than expectation, the way she had done 100 times before while cleaning. This time, her fingers caught on a stone that gave slightly beneath her touch, looser than the ones around it. "Trevor," she said, her voice suddenly quiet. "Come look at this." The healing room smelled of dried lavender and old paper, a scent Lila had known her whole life. She ran her fingers along the shelves, remembering how her father used to hum while he worked, how he always kept a spare cup of tea going cold beside his notes because he forgot to drink it. Trevor searched the desk methodically, checking drawers, lifting loose boards, the way a man searches when he has done this kind of work before. Lila knelt by the herb cabinet, and it was there, behind a stone that wobbled slightly under her palm, that she found it. A small hollow in the wall, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp, a leather ledger. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free. She had not expected to find anything. She had only wanted an excuse to sit in her father's room a little longer. She opened the first page, and her breath caught. Names, dates, notes in her father's careful handwriting. Families who had been pressured into surrendering land, false debts invented against people who had never borrowed a coin in their lives, payments made to silence complaints before they reached the Alpha Court. Garrett Bradford's name appeared again and again, alongside a pattern that grew clearer with every page. He knew, Lila whispered. He knew what Garrett was doing, and he was building a case against him. Trevor crossed the room and knelt beside her, reading over her shoulder. His expression, usually so guarded, shifted into something sharper. "This isn't just land theft," he said. "Look at the dates. He's been weakening every border pack around the valley, one family at a time, before the next full moon gathering. If enough packs are broken, no one will have the strength to challenge him when he moves for the valley itself." Lila turned another page, her father's handwriting growing more urgent near the final entries, as though he had known his time to finish the work was running short. There were sketches of property lines, notes comparing Garrett's claimed debts against the actual harvests of the families involved, and a final page listing names of border elders Garrett had likely already pressured into silence, Marshall Ellis among them. He was building this alone, Lila said quietly. No one helping him, no one to trust with it. He must have been so afraid, and he never once mentioned any of it to me. "He was protecting you," Trevor said. A father who understood exactly how dangerous a man like Garrett could be wouldn't have wanted his daughter carrying that danger before she had to. "Maybe," Lila said, "or maybe he simply ran out of time before he could tell me himself." She traced her father's handwriting with her fingertip, feeling the weight of unfinished work settle onto her shoulders alongside her grief. It was strange, holding proof of her father's quiet courage in her hands, wishing more than anything that she could have shared the burden with him while he was still alive to carry it. "You've seen patterns like this before," Lila said. It was not quite a question. Trevor was quiet for a moment, his eyes still on the ledger. "I've been looking into Garrett Bradford for months. Reports reached the throne of a border lord, growing too powerful too quickly. I came to see the truth for myself, instead of trusting only what messengers tell a king from a safe distance." He said it plainly, without weight, but something in the sentence caught in Lila's chest. A king. She did not ask him to explain. Not yet. She was afraid that asking would break whatever fragile trust had grown between them over one long day. Instead, she asked something smaller. "Have you failed before? Trying to stop someone like Garrett?" Trevor's jaw tightened. "Once. A lord much like him, in the Northern Territories. I trusted a report that said the danger was under control. It wasn't. Families suffered because I waited for certainty, instead of acting on what I already knew." He looked at her then, steady and honest. "I don't make that mistake twice." "What happened to them?" Lila asked gently. "The families. Some recovered, some didn't." Trevor's voice stayed even, though something behind his eyes told her the memory still cost him something to speak of. "I was young in the crown then, still learning that a report from a comfortable distance rarely tells the whole truth of what's happening on the ground. I promised myself after that I would see things with my own eyes whenever I could, no matter how inconvenient it made my counsel." "Is that why you travel in disguise? Not because you enjoy the anonymity, but because you don't trust anyone to tell you the truth otherwise?" Trevor considered the question longer than she expected. "Both, if I'm honest. There's a strange kind of relief in being no one for a while. No one asks a traveler in a worn cloak for judgments on matters that will decide 100 lives. But you're right that it started as necessity. It only became something I valued for its own sake much later." Lila closed the ledger gently, holding it against her chest the way she used to hold her father's hand. "He used to tell me a spring doesn't ask who deserves the water," she said. "It only gives. I think that's why Garrett hated him so much. My father gave freely, and Garrett only understands taking." Something shifted in Trevor's expression, softer than before. "Your father sounds like he understood justice better than most men who wear a title for it." Before Lila could answer, a soft knock came at the healing room door. Brinley slipped inside, breathless, her eyes wide with worry. "I came as fast as I could," she said. "I overheard riders talking near the market road. Garrett knows Lila wasn't alone this morning. He's furious." Dalton's been ordered to return with more men before moonrise. Lila's grip tightened on the ledger. How many men? Trevor asked, already moving toward the door. Brinley didn't hear a number, Brinley said, catching her breath. Just that Dalton was furious about being sent away empty-handed, and that Garrett wants this settled before the full moon gathering, one way or another. Lila felt the fragile calm of the afternoon slip away entirely. For a few hours, searching through her father's old notes with Trevor beside her, she had almost let herself forget the danger circling the estate. Now it came rushing back, sharper than before, because now she understood exactly how much was at stake. "They'll come at moonrise," Trevor said, half to himself, already calculating. "Enough time to gather more riders. Not enough time for us to send word to the council and expect help before they arrive." "Then we don't wait for the council," Lila said. "We use what we already have." Trevor looked at her, something like approval flickering across his face. "What do you have in mind?" "My father built this estate to survive hard winters, not just healthy ones," Lila said, tucking the ledger safely inside her coat. "There are ways to slow riders down that Garrett's men have never had to think about, because they've never had to fight for this land the way we have." Brinley looked between them, worry giving way to something steadier. "Tell me what to do." The quiet, hopeful afternoon was over. Whatever came next would not wait for any of them to be ready. But for the first time since her father's death, Lila did not feel like she was facing it alone. The hours after Brinley's warning passed in careful, deliberate motion. Lila and Trevor walked the perimeter of the estate together, marking places where the fence could be reinforced before nightfall, while Brinley ran word to a handful of trusted neighbors who might be willing to help stand watch. It was strange, Lila thought, how quickly fear could turn into purpose when there was finally something useful to do with it. By the time the sun began sinking toward the western hills, painting the courtyard in long amber shadows, the estate looked different than it had that morning. Not fortified exactly, but no longer quite so defenseless either. Lanterns had been gathered near the bell tower. The loose gate latch had been repaired. Trevor had shown two of the older village boys how to signal riders' approach, using nothing more than a mirror and the last of the daylight. Lila was resetting a broken hinge on the healing room shutters when she saw a lone figure approaching from the eastern road, moving slowly, none of the confidence he usually carried anywhere in his step. Marshal Ellis arrived alone at dusk, on foot, without the surrender papers he had carried that morning. Lila saw him from the courtyard and felt her whole body tense. Brinley stepped protectively closer, and Noctis rose from his place by the spring, ears forward, watching the elders' slow approach. "I'm not here on Garrett's business," Marshall said quickly, raising both hands. "I came on my own." "Why should I believe that?" Lila asked. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Marshall's shoulders sagged. Up close, he looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes red-rimmed as though he had not slept. "Because I'm ashamed," he said. "And because your father was kind to me, more than I deserved, and I've spent 6 months repaying that kindness with silence." He told them everything. Garrett had forced him to approve false claims against Lila's land, threatening to cut off his own family's protection if he refused. Worse, Garrett now planned to declare Lila unfit to hold the estate, using her age and her grief against her, and seize the Moonwell under the excuse of pack protection. "He came to me the week after your father's funeral," Marshall said, staring at the ground, "before the grief had even settled over this house. He said the Moonwell needed a firmer hand than a grieving young woman could provide, and that if I didn't cooperate, my own family would lose our grazing rights within the season. I told myself I was protecting my grandchildren. I told myself you'd understand, eventually, that this was simply how the valley worked now." "And did you believe that?" Trevor asked, his voice quiet but direct. Marshall's hands trembled slightly at his sides. "I wanted to. It's easier to believe something when the alternative means standing against a man who controls half the border patrols. But every time I signed one of his papers, I thought of Rowan bringing medicine to my daughter's door in the middle of winter, never once asking what it cost him to make that walk in the snow. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I simply decided wrong was survivable, as long as it wasn't happening to me. I convinced myself I was keeping the peace, Marshall said, his voice breaking. That staying quiet was safer for everyone. But I was only protecting my own comfort while a good man's daughter was left to face this alone. Lila wanted to be angry. Part of her still was. But watching Marshall stand there, stripped of the confidence he wore like armor at Garrett's side, she could not find the cruelty in her voice that she thought this moment deserved. She thought of her father, who had never once turned away a patient for lacking coin, who had treated Marshall's own daughter through a difficult fever without a second thought. She wondered what he would have made of this moment, an old friend finally choosing courage, however late it had come. My father forgave people easily, Lila said slowly. Almost too easily, some of the elders used to say. I used to think that made him foolish. I don't think that anymore. I think it took more strength to keep forgiving people than it would have to simply give up on them. I don't deserve that kind of forgiveness, Marshall said quietly. Maybe not yet, Lila said. But my father would have given you the chance to earn it anyway. I suppose I can do the same. Why come now? She asked instead. Because watching that stranger stop Dalton this morning reminded me what courage looks like, Marshall said. And I hadn't seen it in myself for a long time. Trevor studied him for a long moment. Regret changes nothing on its own. It only matters if it becomes action. Marshall nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for someone to say exactly that. Then let it become action. I still have copies of some of the false claims Garrett forced me to sign. If I bring them to the High Council road station, along with what's in Rowan's ledger, it may be enough to summon witnesses before the full moon gathering. Garrett's riders will be watching the roads, Trevor warned. I know, Marshall said. I'll go anyway. He left before nightfall, copies of the ledger's key pages hidden inside his coat, moving quickly toward the eastern road. Lila watched him go with a strange, aching mixture of anger and relief, the kind that comes from forgiving someone before you are entirely ready to. Once he was gone, the weight of the day finally caught up to her. She sat on the low stone wall near the spring, and though she tried to hold herself together the way she had all morning, her composure finally slipped. It was not loud. It was the quiet, exhausted kind of breaking, the kind that comes after months of being strong, with no one to share the weight. Trevor sat beside her, close but not crowding her, and said nothing for a while. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. Courage doesn't mean you never shake, he said. It means you keep standing anyway. You've been doing that since the moment I arrived. Lila wiped her eyes and looked at him. You still haven't told me why you're really here. Not fully. Trevor was quiet for a long moment, and then, as the first stars appeared above Moonwell Hollow, he told her the truth he had been holding back all day. My name is Trevor Garrison, he said, and I'm not only a traveler, Lila. I am your Alpha King. For a moment, Lila could not speak at all. She looked at Trevor, at the plain cloak, the dust still on his boots, the wolf resting calmly at his side, and tried to reconcile all of it with the word king. Kings did not sleep in courtyards. Kings did not kneel on healing room floors searching through hidden ledgers. Kings did not ask a grieving girl what she wanted, and then wait patiently for her answer. You let me think you were no one, she said finally. I let you see me before you knew what I was, Trevor said. There's a difference. People behave differently around a crown. I needed to see the truth of this valley, not a performance for the king's benefit. Lila felt her face heat, thinking of everything she had said to him that day. Her fears, her father's memory, the ache of being left to manage a threat too large for one person. She had said it all to a stranger. She had, without knowing it, said it all to her king. You must think less of me now, she said quietly, seeing my home like this, my fear, all of it. Trevor turned to face her fully, his expression firm. I think more of you than almost anyone I've met in this kingdom. Nothing about your fear is shameful, Lila. The shame belongs entirely to the men who tried to take what your father built while you were still grieving him. The words settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for months. Why tell me now? Lila asked. You could have kept the secret a while longer, left before I ever had to know. Because you deserved to face tonight, knowing exactly who stood beside you, Trevor said. And because I was tired of watching you thank a stranger for something a king should have done for this valley, long before tonight. Lila studied him for a long moment, searching for the practiced distance she expected from royalty, the careful performance Garrett wore so easily. She found none of it, only the same steady, watchful man who had sat beside her at the well and asked what she wanted, before she had any reason to think his answer would matter beyond one quiet afternoon. I suppose it doesn't change anything, she said finally. You're still the same man who told Dalton to let go of my wrist. A crown doesn't undo that. No, Trevor agreed, something like relief passing briefly across his face. It doesn't. There was little time to sit with the feeling. Word soon reached them through Wren, who came running from the village with news that Garrett's men were gathering on the eastern road, moving toward the hollow with the rising moon. Wren arrived breathless, her brother trailing behind her, both of them wide-eyed with the seriousness of what they had seen. More riders than this morning, Wren said. At least a dozen, maybe more. They're moving slow, like they mean to arrive exactly at moonrise. Garrett wants an audience, Trevor said grimly. He means to make an example of tonight, one way or another. Then let's make sure it's the example he doesn't expect, Lila said. Trevor's calm shifted into something sharper, more focused. He asked Lila to show him every part of the land she knew, not as a helpless girl being protected, but as someone whose knowledge of the estate might decide how the night unfolded. She led him along the hidden goat path behind the spring, showed him the old bell tower that could still be rung to warn the village, pointed out the dry creek bed where riders would struggle to bring horses through quickly, and the stone wall where her father used to store lantern oil for emergencies. You know this land better than any warrior I've brought with me, Trevor said, genuine admiration in his voice. I grew up running across every inch of it, Lila said. Garrett's men have only ever seen it from horseback, deciding what to take. Together, they prepared what little defense the hollow could manage. Villagers positioned near the bell tower, lanterns ready to be lit as signals. Noctis patrolling the tree line where the eastern road met the courtyard. Brinley took charge of the younger children, moving them toward the root cellar beneath the kitchen, calm and steady, despite the fear plain on her face. Wren stood near the bell tower rope, jaw set, refusing to leave when Lila suggested she and her brother might be safer indoors. My brother is alive because of this spring, Wren said. I'm not hiding while someone tries to take it. Lila did not argue further. She recognized the look in Wren's eyes, the same stubborn refusal to be moved that she saw in her own reflection most mornings. As the last of the light faded from the sky, Lila found a quiet moment beside Trevor near the gate, checking the latch her father had built with his own hands. Her heart beat unevenly, not entirely from fear. If this goes wrong tonight, she said quietly, I need you to know that whatever happens to me, the ledger has to reach the council. Marshall is already on his way. Promise me the truth doesn't die here even if I do. Trevor's expression turned fierce, in a way she had not seen from him before. Nothing happens to you tonight, Lila. I didn't come this far to lose the one person in this valley who refused to look away from what was wrong. She held his gaze, a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them that neither had the time to name. Then the distant sound of hooves reached them on the wind, and there was no more time left for anything but readiness. Garrett arrived exactly at moonrise, exactly as expected, with Dalton Keller at his side, and riders including Pierce Donovan and Holden Morrison flanking behind. Garrett himself looked polished even now, his coat immaculate, his expression carefully arranged into offended concern, as though he were the one who had been wronged. Miss Winslow continues to cause unnecessary trouble, Garrett announced to the courtyard, loud enough for the gathered villagers to hear. I've come only to protect this valley from further disorder. He rode further into the courtyard, surveying the gathered villagers with the practiced ease of a man used to an audience. I understand Grief Cloud's judgment. I bore with her refusals for months, out of respect for her father's memory. But a valley cannot run on sentiment alone, and this estate requires a steadier hand than one grieving young woman can provide. A few of the villagers shifted uneasily, old habits of deference still lingering, despite everything they had learned about him. Garrett noticed, and something like satisfaction crossed his face, as though he believed the night might still bend in his favor. "I offer her a fair price for the land," Garrett continued, "more than generous, considering the circumstances. All I ask is that reason finally prevail where stubbornness has failed." Trevor remained in his traveler's cloak, hood low, letting Garrett speak without interruption. He wanted the man to reveal himself fully before anyone intervened. Garrett turned to Dalton. "Take her from the spring. This ends tonight." Dalton stepped forward, reaching for Lila again. This time, she did not step back. Noctis moved instantly, placing his massive body between Dalton and Lila, teeth bared, low growl rumbling through the night air. Trevor reached up and pulled back his hood, and the moonlight caught the royal mark on his collar, unmistakable to anyone who had ever stood before the Alpha Court. Every rider froze. Even the horses went still. Garrett's polished expression cracked for the first time all night, replaced by something close to fear, as he realized the quiet stranger he had dismissed that morning was the one man in the entire kingdom whose authority he could not buy, threaten, or outmaneuver. Alpha King Garrison. Voice wavered as he tried to recover his composure. "I had no idea you were traveling through the borderlands. Had I known, you would have hidden your riders and your false papers better." Trevor finished for him. "I know. That's precisely why I didn't announce myself." Garrett tried to twist the situation, gesturing toward Lila with practiced concern. "This girl is grieving and overwhelmed, Your Majesty. She's unable to manage an estate of this size or importance. I only meant to arrange a fair transfer, for the good of the valley." "I can speak for myself," Lila said, stepping forward. Garrett's eyes flicked toward her, cold and calculating even now. "Careful, Miss Winslow. Grief makes people say things they later regret in front of a king." "Grief hasn't made me say anything I don't mean," Lila said. "It's only made me wait longer than I should have to say it." Her voice trembled at the start, the way it had all day, but it grew steadier with every word. She held up her father's ledger for the gathered villagers to see, opening it to the pages that named names, dates, and false debts. "My father documented every family Garrett Bradford pressured or threatened over the past 2 years," she said. "This isn't grief clouding my judgment. This is proof." A ripple moved through the crowd. Brinley stepped forward first, her voice shaking but clear, describing how Garrett's men had threatened her own family's grazing rights the previous winter. Wren followed, speaking of the false debt claimed against her family after her brother's illness. Aubrey Fletcher, an older woman Lila barely knew, admitted Garrett's men had forced her to sign over a small parcel of land after threatening to withdraw patrol protection during raiding season. One by one, villagers who had stayed silent out of fear finally spoke, each testimony adding weight to the ledger's written proof. Garrett's composure slipped further with every voice that rose against him. He tried once to interrupt, insisting the testimonies were exaggerated, born of old grudges rather than fact, but the sheer number of them made denial impossible to sustain. Pierce Donovan shifted uneasily on his horse, no longer meeting his lord's eyes. Holden Morrison said nothing at all, though his silence had begun to look less like loyalty and more like doubt. "This is absurd," Garrett said, though his voice had lost the polished confidence it carried at the start of the night. "A handful of frightened villagers repeating rumors does not make a case, Your Majesty." "A handful, perhaps," Trevor said, "but your own elder carries written proof, notarized under your own seal. Rumors don't come with a lord's signature attached to them, Bradford." Marshall arrived just then, accompanied by 2 riders bearing the Alpha Court's insignia, witnesses he had reached at the road station before Garrett's men could stop him. He held up the copies he had carried, confirming everything Lila had already shown the crowd. Dalton Keller, seeing the tide turn completely against Garrett, took a step back from his side. "He ordered me to frighten her," Dalton admitted, his earlier confidence gone. "I never intended for things to go further than that." Lila looked at him, remembering the calm, unshakable grip of his hand around her wrist that morning, the ease with which he had assumed no one would stop him. It was strange to see that same man now, shoulders bent, voice unsteady, suddenly aware that power borrowed from someone else disappeared the moment its source collapsed. "You didn't need Garrett's permission to let go of me," Lila said quietly. "You had a choice this morning. You just didn't like the one that meant standing up to him." Dalton had no answer for that. He looked down at the ground, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed smaller than the fear he had spent months building around himself. "Intentions don't undo actions," Trevor said, though his tone remained level rather than harsh. "You'll face judgment before the council, along with everyone who carried out these orders. I won't have blood spilled tonight over what the truth can settle on its own." Garrett's men lowered their eyes, one after another, as the villagers who had once been too frightened to meet their gaze now stood firm before them. Garrett's authority, built on fear and silence, crumbled the moment both were finally gone. "You have no proof I ordered any of this personally," Garrett tried one last time, though even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded now. "I have your seal on 3 of the false debt claims," Marshall said quietly. "I know, because I was the one Garrett forced to notarize them." He looked around the courtyard, searching for allies among his own riders, and found none. Pierce Donovan had already dismounted, standing apart from Garrett's side, his expression caught somewhere between shame and relief that the truth had finally surfaced without his own hand forcing it into the open. Holden Morrison lowered his eyes entirely, unwilling to meet the stares of villagers he had once ridden past without a second glance. "You're all making a grave mistake," Garrett tried, his voice rising, though it carried none of the authority it once had. "I've protected this valley for years. Ask anyone how much worse things were before I brought order to these borderlands." No one answered him. The silence that followed was more damning than any accusation could have been. The last of Garrett's composure fell away. Trevor stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Garrett Bradford, you'll return with the council's riders to answer for land theft, extortion, and the abuse of pack authority. Moonwell Hollow, and the spring it protects, is declared land under the Alpha Court's direct protection, held by Lila Winslow, as her father intended." The crowd, silent for so long, finally let out a sound that was half relief and half disbelief. Villagers embraced each other in small clusters around the courtyard, tears mixing freely with tired laughter. Brinley gripped Lila's arm, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Wren lifted her brother onto her hip, pointing toward Trevor and Noctis and telling him, in a voice loud enough for half the courtyard to hear, that this was the night the Hollow finally stopped being afraid. Even Marshall, standing a little apart from the celebration, looked lighter than he had in months, as though some old weight had finally been set down after being carried too long. He caught Lila's eye across the courtyard and offered a small, uncertain nod, the beginning of an apology that would take far more than one night to finish. Lila stood beside the well, the ledger still in her hands, watching Garrett led away under guard. She had spent 6 months feeling like the last quiet ember of her father's legacy, easily extinguished. Standing there now, surrounded by neighbors who had finally found their voices, she did not feel quiet, and she did not feel alone. Trevor did not speak over her in that moment. He stood beside her, letting her be seen exactly as she was, not rescued, but heard. When their eyes met across the courtyard, there was nothing left unspoken between them but one thing. The days after Garrett's arrest moved slowly, the way days always do, when a long-held fear finally lifts, and a person has to learn how to breathe without it. Council riders escorted Garrett Bradford away before sunrise, the morning after the confrontation, along with Pierce Donovan and 2 other riders who had carried out his orders without question. Dalton Keller went with them, silent now, stripped of the confidence that had once made him so unsettling to face. Holden Morrison, who had said little throughout the whole affair, chose to stay behind and offer testimony to the council on behalf of families Garrett had threatened over the years. It was a small redemption, but Lila found she no longer had the energy to hold on to anger toward every man who had once stood on the wrong side of her courtyard. Word of Garrett's fall spread quickly through the neighboring valleys, carried by traveling merchants and border patrols alike. Some of the stories exaggerated the danger of that final night, turning Trevor into a figure of legend within days. But Lila found she didn't mind the embellishments much. If a little exaggeration meant other border estates felt braver about reporting their own troubles to the Alpha Court, she was willing to let the stranger on the Black Wolf grow a little larger in the retelling. Moonwell Hollow began to change almost immediately. Villagers who had avoided the estate out of fear now returned in groups, repairing fences, clearing the courtyard of debris, sweeping the healing room clean of 6 months of neglect. Brinley organized supplies with the same steady determination she had shown since childhood, while Wren brought her younger brother to help carry water, proud to finally do something in return for the spring that had once saved his life. Aubrey Fletcher brought bread every morning, setting it on the kitchen step without a word, as though small kindnesses could slowly repay a silence she still carried guilt over. Marshall Ellis came often as well, though never with the confidence he once carried as an elder. He worked quietly, mending what he could, listening more than he spoke. He told Lila once, while repairing the gate her father had built decades earlier, that he did not expect forgiveness, only the chance to be useful in whatever way she would allow. "You already have that chance," Lila told him. "What you do with it is what matters now." The healing room reopened properly within the week, its shelves restocked with fresh herbs, its lanterns lit again each evening for anyone who needed them. Word traveled quickly through the neighboring villages that Moonwell Hollow was safe once more, and families who had stayed away out of fear during Garrett's rise began arriving again, some carrying old debts of gratitude they had never been able to repay while danger hung over the estate. An elderly farmer named Colby Fletcher, a distant cousin of Aubrey's, arrived one afternoon with a wagon full of lumber, insisting on rebuilding the section of barn that had fallen into disrepair since Rowan's death. When Lila tried to refuse the gift, he only shook his head. "Your father set my leg after a fall 15 years ago, Colby said. "Never asked me for a single coin. I've been waiting a long time for a chance to pay some of that back." Moments like that arrived almost daily, small and unassuming, each one stitching the hollow back together in ways Lila had not expected, grief and fear to allow. She found herself, for the first time since her father's death, looking forward to mornings instead of simply enduring them. Trevor remained at Moonwell Hollow through all of it, though his guards, a small, quiet escort that had been waiting discreetly at the edge of the forest since his arrival, grew increasingly restless as the days passed. A king could not stay indefinitely at a border estate, however important its spring, however unresolved its healing might still be. Lila knew this. She had known it, in the back of her mind, since the moment he told her his true name. She assumed, without ever saying it aloud, that he would leave the way every powerful person eventually left. Once the danger had passed, and the crisis no longer required his presence. On the 5th morning, before the rest of the household had woken, Lila found herself at the spring alone. Mist rose off the water the way it had the morning everything began, silver and quiet, catching the earliest light. She sat on the low stone wall, running her fingers along the same place where Dalton's grip had once bruised her wrist, now faded to nothing. She heard footsteps behind her and did not need to turn to know who they belonged to. Trevor sat beside her, Noctis settling into the grass a short distance away, content in a way the wolf had not seemed since their arrival. The alertness of days spent guarding a threatened home finally allowed to rest. "You'll be leaving soon," Lila said. It was not quite a question. "My council has sent 3 messages already, asking when I intend to return," Trevor admitted. "Kingdoms don't run themselves, no matter how much I might wish otherwise." Lila nodded, keeping her eyes on the water. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I don't think I ever managed to say it properly, in the middle of all of it." "You don't need to thank me," Trevor said. "You saved Moonwell Hollow, Lila, not me. You refused to surrender long before I ever rode out of that tree line. I only made sure the truth had a chance to be heard. You gave me the chance to be believed," she said. "That's not a small thing." They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy, the way it had in the earliest days of his arrival. The spring reflected the soft gold of the rising sun, and somewhere behind them, the village was slowly waking, the sound of a distant hammer already at work on a fence post. "Can I ask you something?" Lila said finally. "Anything. Why did you really stay this long? The council has clearly wanted you back for days. You could have left the moment Garrett was taken into custody." Trevor was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the same care he had shown since the morning they met. "At first, I stayed because justice wasn't finished," he said. "There were witnesses to gather, testimony to secure, a village that needed to see its safety confirmed, before I trusted it to hold on its own." He turned to look at her fully. "But that finished 3 days ago, Lila. I stayed after that because of you." Something in Lila's chest tightened, warm and uncertain all at once. "I don't know how to be someone a king stays for," she admitted quietly. "I've spent the last 6 months being told what to give up, what to sign, what to accept. No one's asked me what I wanted since my father died, except you." "You don't have to know how to be anything," Trevor said. "I'm not asking you to become someone new. I'm asking to stay close to who you already are. The woman who refused to sign away her father's spring, even when everyone around her told her it would be easier to give in." Lila studied the water for a long moment, watching the way the morning light broke apart across its surface. "I've watched what happens to women who marry for protection instead of choice," she said. "Ren's mother did, years ago, and I've seen what it costs to spend a life being grateful instead of loved. I don't want gratitude, Trevor, even for you." "I'm not offering gratitude," Trevor said. "I've had plenty of that from people who wanted something from the crown. I'd rather have your honesty, even if it takes you years to decide you want anything to do with me beyond friendship." Something in his voice, steady and utterly without demand, settled the last of her hesitation more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. "Then let me ask again," Trevor said. "Not as a king, just as a man who has watched you stand up to more in 1 week than most people face in a lifetime, and who would be honored to court you properly, in daylight, with your choice placed above anything I could offer you by title." He did not reach for her hand. He did not press for an answer. He simply waited, the way he had waited that first afternoon by the well, patient enough to let her arrive at her own truth, instead of handing it to her. Lila thought of her father, of the quiet strength he had shown every day of his life, without ever needing a crown to prove it. She thought of the villagers who had finally found their voices, of Brinley's loyalty, of Ren's small brother running freely through a courtyard that no longer belonged to fear. She thought of 6 months spent being pressured into decisions that were never truly hers, and of this one moment, finally, being entirely her own to make. "I choose hope," she said softly. "I choose you, Trevor. Not because you're a king, because you asked." The smile that crossed his face was unlike anything she had seen from him before. Not the calm control of a ruler, not the careful stillness of a stranger measuring danger, but open warmth, the look of someone who had finally gotten the answer he had hoped for, and had not quite dared to expect. Trevor left 3 days later, as the council's messages grew impossible to ignore any longer. His departure was nothing like Garrett's arrival had been. No riders surrounding the courtyard, no fear rippling through the village at the sound of hooves. Instead, half the hollow gathered to see him off, waving as he mounted Noctis at the edge of the tree line. He promised to return before the next full moon, and unlike every other promise powerful men had made to Lila over the past 6 months, she found she believed this one completely. "I'll hold you to that," she told him, standing at the gate her father had built, the morning light catching gold in her hair. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Trevor said. Brinley stood nearby, arms crossed, pretending not to watch too closely, though the small smile she couldn't quite hide gave her away. Ren's brother waved enthusiastically at Noctis, until the wolf turned his great head and huffed something that might almost have been fondness in return. "Take care of her," Trevor said quietly to Brinley, before mounting. "I always have," Brinley answered. "Now I suppose I share the job." He looked back once before the trees swallowed the path, and the warmth in his expression stayed with her long after he had gone. Moonwell Hollow was different now, in ways both small and enormous. The spring still glowed faintly before dawn, the way it always had. Families still walked for hours to reach it during hard winters, and Lila still greeted every one of them the way her father used to, without asking what they could offer in return. But the fear that had hung over the estate since Rowan Winslow's death was gone, replaced by something steadier, a village that had learned it could stand together, and a young woman who had finally learned she did not have to stand alone. In the quiet moments between chores and visitors, Lila found herself returning often to her father's healing room, no longer as a place of grief, but as a place of purpose. She began keeping her own notes there, in handwriting that looked more like his with every passing week, recording which families needed what, and when, exactly as he once had. It felt less like carrying on his legacy out of obligation, and more like discovering it had been hers all along, waiting patiently for her to grow into it. That evening, Lila walked to the spring as the sun set behind the hills, carrying 2 cups from her father's old kitchen shelf. She filled them both with Moonwell water and set them side by side on the stone wall, the way her father used to, when he wanted to remember someone who mattered. 1 cup she left for her father's memory, for the man who had taught her that a spring gives freely to whoever needs it, and that mercy was never a weakness. The other she left for the king who had arrived as a stranger on a black wolf, who had asked nothing of her except the truth, and who had promised, with the quiet certainty of someone who always kept his word, that he would come back before the next moon rose over Moonwell Hollow. The weeks that followed asked more of Lila than grief ever had, but they asked it gently, in the way that healing usually does. She spent her mornings in the garden her father had planted years before, coaxing new herbs from soil that had gone untended since his death, and her afternoons in the healing room, teaching Wren the names of roots and remedies, the way her father had once taught her. It surprised her how much she enjoyed it. Not the burden of responsibility, but the quiet satisfaction of passing on something that mattered. Marshall Ellis visited often, no longer as an elder seeking forgiveness, but as a neighbor earning trust, one honest day at a time. He rebuilt the fence along the eastern border with his own hands, refusing every offer of payment, and slowly, the villagers stopped flinching when his name came up in conversation. Redemption, Lila was learning, was rarely a single grand gesture. More often it looked like showing up, again and again, until trust had a reason to return. Brinley teased her more than once about the 2nd cup she still filled at the spring every evening, though never unkindly. "You'd think a king would send word more than once a week," she said one afternoon, watching Lila read yet another letter that had arrived by royal courier. "He's rebuilding trust between border packs and the Alpha Court," Lila said, though the smile tugging at her mouth gave away exactly how little she minded the wait. "Apparently that takes longer than riding off with one troublesome girl's heart." "Troublesome," Brinley repeated, laughing. "That's one word for it." The full moon arrived on a clear night, the kind where the sky over Moonwell Hollow seemed close enough to touch. Lila stood at the gate before sunset, telling herself she was only checking the latch, though she had checked it 3 times already that day. She heard Noctis before she saw him, a low, familiar sound carried on the evening wind, and then the black wolf emerged from the tree line exactly where he had the very first time, dust on his rider's boots, moonlight catching pale against dark fur. Trevor dismounted before Noctis had fully stopped moving, closing the distance between them without hurry, but without hesitation either. He looked less like a traveler this time, and more like a man who had counted every day since he last stood in this courtyard. "You came," Lila said, though she had never truly doubted it. "I told you I would," Trevor said. "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." She smiled, feeling something in her chest loosen, that had been tightly wound since the moment his letters had started arriving less frequently than she wanted. "The council kept you longer than expected." "The council will always find a reason to keep a king longer than expected," Trevor said. "I decided this once was long enough." Villagers began gathering at the sound of the wolf's arrival, no longer with fear, but with open curiosity and warmth, calling greetings across the courtyard. Wren's younger brother ran straight for Noctis without a trace of caution, and the great wolf lowered his head to let the boy pat his fur, patient as ever. Trevor's attention, though, stayed on Lila. "I brought something," he said, reaching into his cloak and producing a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Inside was a seal, newly forged, bearing the mark of Moonwell Hollow beside the royal crest of the Alpha Court. "It's official now. This land, this spring, and everything your father built here answers to no one but you, protected directly under the crown for as long as you wish to hold it." Lila turned the seal over in her hands, throat tight. "My father would have hated fuss like this." "Your father built something worth protecting properly," Trevor said. "I think he'd have made peace with a little fuss, if it meant no one could ever threaten it again." She looked up at him, the courtyard alive around them with laughter and lantern light, the spring glowing silver behind her, exactly as it had the morning everything began. So much had changed since that first cold dawn. The fear, the danger, the quiet grief that had followed her every waking hour. And what remained, steady beneath all of it, was the spring itself, giving freely to whoever needed it, exactly as her father had always meant it to. And beside it now, for the first time in a long while, Lila did not feel like the last quiet ember of something ending. She felt like the beginning of something new. "Walk with me," she said, offering her hand. Trevor took it without hesitation, and together they walked toward the water, the black wolf following at a comfortable distance, the whole of Moonwell Hollow bright and unafraid beneath the rising moon.